All right, our final speaker is going to be another Red Youth comrade of ours who helped us set up the group, and his name is Alex. So here's Alex. He's going to be speaking on the Chinese Revolution and Mao Zedong.
Greetings, everybody. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you for our previous speakers to have done such a tremendous job thus far. So I'm talking about China and the Chinese Revolution and the experience led by Mao Zedong. And first, to talk about achievements, we need to talk about the conditions that existed prior to these achievements to really get a good base point. So prior to 1949, which is when the Chinese Communist Revolution really solidified itself, China was a semi-feudal society. What does that mean? Up to about the mid-19th century, about the time of the Opium War in 1840, China was more or less feudal. They had feudal class relations with a landlord class, a monarch-like class, and the peasantry that served them, who created all the wealth. But this shift after the Opium War, the economy of China began to shift toward capitalism due to mostly imperialist inflow of capital, as Michael had spoken about earlier. Nations like Japan, England, and France were beginning to have a need to export capital to other nations in order to maintain their profits, and China was one of those places that they were doing this. And how are they doing this? They were collaborating with the feudal class that existed within China during this time period, and trying to develop commodity production while at the same time keeping the ruling class happy. So this put China in this semi-feudal, semi-colonial state where they were, the value of the workers' labor in Chinese society was in one part being exported to the imperialist centers, and in the other part being handed over to the same feudal lords that they were serving for centuries earlier. But this relationship kind of lessened during World War I when the imperialist nations were fighting amongst each other, mostly in Europe, some parts in the Middle East. And what emerged in China was the disintegration of the Chinese emperor and a number of different warlord factions who were struggling to maintain control over the developing industrialization that was going on in China. So there were two factions that emerged to resist this, and they were the nationalist Kuomintang, or the KMT, and of course the Communist Party of China, which at this point was not led by Mao Zedong, but he was a member of the party along with a number of others who were prominent within the Chinese Communist Party after the revolution. So during the struggle, the two maintained an alliance to fight against the warlord faction, and after that issue was resolved more or less and China was unified, the two entered in civil war with one another. As the Communist Party had been building up a mass base, and the KMT was trying to maintain control over just the capitalist economy, and they were opposed to the measures that the Communist Party was doing, arming the peasantry and trying to organize them to fight for their own good. After the Civil War began, they fought for about a decade, and then the Japanese during World War II began to invade China. So the two once again at least had a ceasefire and jointly opposed the Japanese. But meanwhile, while the KMT was not fighting the Communist Party was able to build up a mass base of support amongst the peasantry themselves. And so by the end of World War II, the Chinese Communist Party had about 1.2 million actually armed troops and another 2 million armed peasant militia groups, with which that they used to defeat the KMT in 1949 when they retreated to Taiwan. So that was the events leading up to the Chinese Revolution. So what happened after the fact? One of the first things that the Communist Party had enacted was a land reform, and this was one of the major issues that the peasants themselves had problems with, because the landlords were very patriarchal, they were very chauvinist, and they treated the peasantry very poorly, and so there was a lot of gripe that the people had with the landlords. And so using members of the Communist Party to go out into the different areas within China and organize peasant associations. They collectively they confiscated the land from the landlords and then redistributed it so that the different peasant families were able to begin working for their own good. And we saw a definite increase in agricultural production during this era. They went from about 0.5% growth per year to about 3% growth, and this is only over a short period of time. Furthermore, after the Chinese Revolution was successful, the life expectancy and infant mortality increased substantially. And now moving much further ahead, between the time period of about 1949 to 1975, the life expectancy of a Chinese citizen doubled from 32 to 65 years. And also talking about infant mortality, that rate went off a cliff during the same time period, where about in 1970, actually in Shanghai, the infant mortality rate was at a lower rate than what existed here in New York City. Other achievements, there was a large social reform that took place during this time period. They took an unprecedented reform against the patriarchal social relations of the feudal era. For instance, one of the first laws that they had passed in 1950 was a law establishing marriage by mutual consent. No longer were these arranged marriages that family members would more or less sell their daughters to other families for political gain or economic gain, what have you. So there was a mutual consent, and also they granted the right for women to divorce. This did not exist prior to the revolution. Men were in control and women were treated as property. The Communist Party completely changed that. They also outlawed other things like the sale of children, again, relating to arranged marriages and things like this. Another issue, literacy rates, they skyrocketed between this period, 1949 to 76, from about 15% of the population being able to read to between 80 and 90%. And also one of the policies that the Communist Party encouraged was just people to read Marxist philosophy and people to read and become engaged in the political workings of their government. From the very beginning, people were encouraged to be a part of the larger social system. Additionally, universal healthcare system was established, providing healthcare services for free or at a very low cost. And throughout this time period, there were about 1.3 million peasants who were trained to be healthcare providers for free, so that way they can go back to their villages and provide health care for the people that needed it. And it's not to say that there were not blunders involved in the Chinese revolutionary experience. There was the unfortunate confluence of both poor weather. There was flooding. There were periods of intense flooding, and there were periods of intense drought that crippled the agricultural production during the time period known as the Great Leap Forward, which was also a policy which tried to have a very rapid industrialization of the Chinese economy, but this ended up leading to a large-scale famine. But it's also worth noting that despite this, this was the last famine that ever occurred in China. Prior to that, there's one statistic that I found that between 108 BC and 1911 AD, there were 1,828 major famines in China. That's about one famine per year, every year, for over a century. So that was a huge success beyond looking past that. And also, in addition to that, despite these problems that they had faced, the Chinese economy still grew at a rate of about 10% a year, and agricultural production maintained at a growth rate of about 3% a year between this time period, 1949 to 1976. And again, there was an unprecedented engagement of the masses in their governing operations and the way that they had, the way that people engaged in their lives on a daily basis. There were workers' councils, student councils, peasant associations, and things of this nature having an influence on things that affected them immediately in their immediate sphere of life. And so it's important to talk about also the contributions that the Chinese experience gave to scientific socialism, Marxism, Leninism, as Michael had stated earlier, but also originally the Chinese were calling it Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, but now it's more widely considered to be called Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, MLM. So Maoist theory of revolution expanded upon Lenin's theory of the vanguard party and its role of organizing the masses through something called the mass line. The slogan around this was from the masses to the masses. Essentially, people were tasked with going into the communities, tasked with investigating what the social situation was, understanding what people's concerns were, understanding what their ideas were, collecting all of these things together, and then going back to them with these ideas and saying, this is what you've wanted, this is how we're going to go about doing this. They would put it through a Marxist perspective and basically help guide the people in determining their own life. And this was put into practice in the revolutionary military strategy that was developed, known as the Protracted People's War, where building a mass base to begin to launch your attack against the capitalist system in three phases. The strategic defensive, which is the mass building phase, which would then lead up to a strategic equilibrium where the forces of the communists would be rather equal with the capitalists, and then the offensive where you'd make the final push to seize the state, which was successful in China. This tactic was also successfully employed in Nepal and is currently in use consciously by the communist parties in both India and in the Philippines. And throughout it's a lot of focus on guerrilla warfare and fighting battles that can only be won, not putting troops out there where they're obviously going to be put in harm's way. Not to say that war is safe in any way, shape, or form, but moving on. And then also, contrary to the Soviet experience, where I think the Communist Party of the USSR saw the contradictions not so much as a contradiction between elements of the bourgeoisie that may have remained after the revolution. They saw it simply as problems with society in general. But Mao and the Maoists identified that even during socialism, the struggle between communists and the bourgeoisie, between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, still continues, and you have to fight these tendencies from emerging even after a socialist government has been established in a given nation. And the prime example of this manifesting in practice is the instigation of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which was really a culmination of all the things that were going on from the beginning of the revolution up to that point in the 60s, where you had masses of people mobilized to basically confront the bureaucracy and confront the things that they had disagreed with on a large scale. And this is, call it Occupy Wall Street on steroids or something. But yes, there was a lot of people call them excesses and things like that. But overall, this helped safeguard the Chinese Revolution from deteriorating more quickly back into a capitalist state. It saved socialism. So again, and just to talk one more point about, there's a lot of slanders about historic communist experiences in the Soviet Union, in China. A lot of talk about authoritarianism and dictatorship, things like that. But like Caleb was bringing up in the beginning, we have to realize that we'll say, yes, it is a dictatorship. It's a dictatorship of the proletariat, as opposed to the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie that exists right now. And these slanders are coming out of the mainstream media. They want us to be adverse to the idea of a workers' state establishing itself, the workers coming together and fighting for themselves against the interests of the bourgeoisie. And so for them, yes, it is an authoritarian hellhole if you can't engage in bourgeois production. But for the workers, it is the only way to push forward to a better life. Thank you.